Welcome to this episode of the Animals at Home podcast. My name is Dillon. Thank you very much for joining me today. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be reading an article that I wrote for reptiles.com. Now, I started writing this article back in August, and it actually has taken me a long time to finish it. Plus, it sort of snowballed into a much longer and more in-depth article than I originally intended. So it's now over 5,000 words long. So because of that, I figured I might as well record a podcast and a YouTube version for those of you that would rather listen than read. I know there's plenty of people out there as well as myself that would rather listen than read. So if you're one of those people, then this is for you. I want to jump right into it, but before I do, if you find this valuable, whether or not you disagree or agree with what I'm about to say, if you think this is a conversation that's worth having within the reptile industry, I urge you to share this. Share this on Facebook with the Facebook groups, your friend group, maybe your Herp Society, anybody that would be interested in this conversation, please share it. There's a lot of clickbait out there and all these different things, and I understand why clickbait gets popular, but I don't want to use clickbait. But because of that, really the only way to get this video on eyes is with you guys sharing it. So let's get to the article. The reptile industry is young. It wasn't long ago when the average reptile enthusiast was left to their own devices in order to care for their animals. This was due to a lack of development on both a technological and knowledge-based level. 10 years ago, the crested gecko was just breaking into the mainstream pet market. Of course, today it is now an industry staple. Go back 20 years and you'll see an industry riddled with aquariums and metabolic bone disease. And go back 30 years and you'll see black lights and other bizarre non-reptile related devices being used in lieu of proper equipment. As crazy as the past seems, it was necessary. The pioneers of our industry were restricted to the trial and error method for everything they did. This has granted us with a firm foundation of knowledge and technology to stand on in the present. Just think of how far the industry has come within the past decade. We've seen massive advancements in housing, lighting, diets, substrates, and continue to add new species to the list of animals that we can competently rear and breed. I believe the reptile industry can roughly be broken into 3 distinct eras of progression. I'm a very visual person, so I'll use some imagery to illustrate the way I conceptualize the industry's progress. Imagine you are standing in a very, very large room. This room is full of knowledge. Everything there is to know about keeping reptiles is waiting to be discovered inside this room. Unfortunately, there are no lights, and the room is pitch black. You must first bumble around in the dark in hopes of stumbling into something useful. In this metaphor, your knowledge base is represented by the instrument you use to illuminate your surroundings. Or more specifically, your knowledge base is represented by the amount of light your instrument throws off. As you begin to move around the room, you use a single flamed candlestick. This does not allow you to see very far, but it does allow you to start investigating the room. Fortunately, just the act of exploring the room is all that is necessary to increase the power of your lighting instrument. As you move around the room and discover novel information, your knowledge base begins to grow and your lighting instrument is exchanged for something with more power. Now imagine you have a flashlight instead of a candlestick. The flashlight sheds light on a larger radius and thus exposes more of the knowledge kept within the room. This process continues to repeat itself until one day the room is nearly illuminated in its entirety. Likewise, one day you could understand everything there is to know about keeping reptiles. It may not be a realistic goal, but it is one we should always be striving for. We should always be striving to learn more about the amazing creatures we decide to keep in our homes. Let's return to the eras of the reptile industry as I mentioned above. I refer to the first era of the reptile industry as the Dark Ages. During this era of the industry, everything was new. Every species, every care method, everything. Many of the captive reptiles who were alive during this time were sentenced to premature death due to lack of knowledge and experience. This was a necessary evil. Eventually, the reptile industry grew out of the Dark Ages and began to emerge into the mainstream pet market. This marks the second era of the reptile industry. At this point in time, husbandry requirements for common animals such as ball pythons, leopard geckos, and bearded dragons were accurate and clear enough that the average novice off the street could care for them relatively successfully. However, technology was still lacking. For example, both lighting and heating were not well understood, which left heat mats and red light bulbs with the impossible task of replicating the sun. During this era, breeding was, for the most part, left up to professional breeders or advanced enthusiasts. The third era is our current one, and I refer to it as the era of the breeder. As the reptile community's knowledge continued to expand, there was a shift that occurred in the breeding of common species. Suddenly, there was enough information and proper equipment that the everyday enthusiast could tackle a breeding project on their own. This did have an effect on the reptile industry, although maybe not in the way you might have initially guessed. It is not that people began to overproduce animals, although there is some of that. It is more so that people began caring for their animals as if they were breeding on a large scale. Despite the ability to breed becoming more accessible for many people, the percentage of breeders in the industry did not increase significantly. Instead, the most potent change was the visibility of the major breeders. As the internet shot from infancy to adolescence, reptile enthusiasts were suddenly brought directly into the facilities of major breeders via online picture and video. This meant newcomers were perpetually exposed to the industrialized breeding standards without necessarily realizing that what they were seeing on YouTube was appropriate for mass-scale breeding, but not for individual animal care. Consequently, many reptiles are currently subjected to ultra-sterile, ultra-bare, and unenriched environments with no plan to be bred in the future. This, I will argue, is an unintentional violation of basic animal welfare standards, unintentional being the key word. For the sake of clarity, I will define what I mean by industrialized style care. When I use the term industrialized, I'm referring to rack systems with small bare tubs typically lined with paper substrate and little to no decor. I'm going to focus specifically on snake breeding systems for two main reasons. One, to keep a tighter scope on this article, and two, although rack systems can be used for other reptiles, they are most popular with snakes. Though keep in mind, everything you're about to hear can and should be extrapolated to other reptile species. The quality of a snake's captive environment can be thought of as a continuum. On the left side of the continuum, we have industrialized style tub setups, and on the right side, we have zoo-level bioactive enclosures. It is probably important to note here that I'm ignoring downright inexcusable husbandry, the husbandry you might see on Craigslist, for example. The issue I perceive with being on the tub side of the continuum is it offers no room for growth. Once you have established your setup, the tub, paper sheet, and water dish, you're done. The opportunity to continue to develop your snake's environment for the better vanishes. As far as I'm concerned, anything just to the right of the tub end on the continuum is all that is necessary in order to achieve appropriate welfare standards. Tub setups are static with no ambition to change. They are what they are. On a psychological level, a tub is static because as a keeper, you don't think about developing a tub beyond the simple practicality of what it is. And also the physical restraints of the tub mean that extensive development is not possible. Creating a habitat that has the potential for environmental enrichment is key. It is as if the continuum is a flat line followed directly by a long, low-grade downward slope. The tub side of the continuum lies on the flat surface, and the rest of the continuum, ranging everything from simple enclosure with a few enrichment features to zoo-level bioactive enclosures, flows down from there. Once you budge yourself off the flat surface of the tub end of the continuum, development flows naturally. Without momentum, there can be no change. Nobody would recommend starting on the far right side of the continuum with a complex bioactive enclosure. However, novice reptile keepers should be encouraged to A, understand the natural history of the animal they are keeping, and B, be able to visualize how they might further develop their animal's enclosure in the future when they are ready to do so. Now, quite often the rack debate is centered around ball pythons. Even when writing this and recording this podcast, my mind continues to drift in that direction. The common claim is that ball pythons spend the majority amount of their time in underground burrows. Therefore, a dark, cramped tub is a suitable environment because it is replicating the snake's natural habitat. This is incorrect. There's plenty of peer-reviewed evidence refuting this claim, and I do have everything. I do get into this further in a little bit, and links are in the description in the show notes and whatnot. But moreover, the reality is that racks are used for many different species of snakes. The burrow defense does not translate well for colubrids, for example, who are generally quite active and are prone to climb. This alone should be enough to expose the flawed logic behind keeping snakes in tubs. Before I move on, here is something very much worth noting. I am not against the everyday enthusiast striking up a small breeding project, provided the finer details are ironed out beforehand, such as offspring care, responsible selling, etc. Small batch breeding, to steal a TC Houston term, at home is a great way for individuals to advance themselves in the industry. This is especially true for those who no longer feel challenged while performing the everyday tasks of basic husbandry. Whether or not you are aware, as an enthusiast, you are in a perpetual state of trying to raise the bar. Your most enjoyable moments in the reptile industry are when you are pushing yourself just beyond your current skill set. I'm talking about those moments when time disappears and you pour hours into a project without stopping to eat, check your phone, or sleep. Carving out new territory for yourself in the dark room is where most of us derive our purpose from. We have a need to push ourselves into the darkness to discover something new. Repetitive motions of tasks already mastered are boring, and the only cure to that boredom is using creative energy to tackle a new challenge. Breeding solves that problem almost perfectly. It doesn't matter how long you've been breeding animals for, there is always a new problem around the corner, a new challenge for you to solve. Now, breeding is one of the ways to advance yourself in the industry, but there are many others. For example, you might attempt to go bioactive. You could read academic material on the animals you keep. You could develop a clearer understanding of the natural ecological niche your animals thrive in. You could even try to train your animals. For example, you might try target training or using puzzle feeders. Again, I am not advocating to stop people from breeding. However, I believe it is important to understand why somebody might decide to breed and offer alternatives that would satisfy the same need. In my opinion, the era of the breeder is a speed bump in our industry's progress. Again, the problem is not that too many people are breeding, it is that the care standards have been dialed back to industrialized style care for everyone. As I've stated many times, I believe industrialized style care has its place. We need breeders to supply the market with high quality, healthy, captive bred animals. It's possible rack systems and small tubs are the only way to mass produce animals while maintaining a healthy breeding stock. It is also entirely possible that we discover somewhere in the dark room some information that would allow us to breed in a more enriching way, although that is outside the scope of this podcast and article. Most people who own snakes are not big-time breeders or small-time breeders. The majority of people involved in the reptile community are pet keepers, not breeders. The promotion of industrialized style care is being confused with proper pet husbandry. I think the popularity of YouTube is to blame here. Snake breeding businesses are romanticized online, which causes the beginner to assume you should keep your single ball python in the same way a popular breeder keeps thousands. Now, why shouldn't the average enthusiast keep their animals in a plain tub setup? If the animals in these industrialized setups are breeding, then they must be healthy and thriving, right? Well, to quote John Courtney Smith, just because you can keep a leopard gecko in a 12-inch by 12-inch by 3-inch box in the dark and it will live and reproduce doesn't mean to say we ought to. It just proves that the power of reproduction within nature is a far greater force than any level of poor care we feel selfish enough to visit upon them. Now, of course, I love that quote. I think it summarizes that perfectly. However, the initial questions about why not keep them in a tub are still valid. And the only way to answer those questions is by running an audit on industrialized style care. And the only way to do that is by using an objective set of standards and guidelines as a base. I propose that we use the 5 provisions and animal welfare aims paradigm as our guideline. This will be a quick overview of the creation of the 5 freedoms and how they have since been modified. The 5 freedoms were developed by the UK government in the 1970s and were initially intended to increase the welfare of farm animals. Since their creation, the 5 freedoms have undergone some changes. Here are the original 5 freedoms. 1. Freedom from thirst, hunger, and malnutrition. 2. Freedom from discomfort and exposure. 3. Freedom from pain, injury, and disease. 4. Freedom from fear and distress. And 5, freedom to express normal behavior. David J. Mellor has since adjusted the original 5 freedoms, a process which he outlines in his paper, Moving Beyond the 5 Freedoms by Updating the 5 Provisions and Introducing Aligned Animal Welfare Aims. Mellor received his PhD in 1969 from Edinburgh University and spent 10 years as a professor and head of Department of Physiology and Anatomy in the Veterinary Science faculty at Massey University in New Zealand. Currently, he is still at Massey University, where he holds the positions of Distinguished Scientist, Director of Animal Welfare Science and Bioethics Center, Professor of Applied Welfare Science, and Professor of Applied Physiology and Bioethics. This is an individual who is actively researching what it means to care for animals ethically. According to Meller, the scientific definition of animal welfare has evolved in the past 30 years, which is what required the 5 freedoms to be updated. Initially, animal welfare was defined using biological function alone, and the focus was on minimizing negative experiences, for example, thirst. Now, mental states are incorporated into the definition of animal welfare. Here's how the University of California, Davis defines it. Animal welfare is the biological and psychological state of an animal as it attempts to cope with its environment. Therefore, welfare includes both pleasurable and unpleasant mental states, such as contentment, anxiety, and fear. While an animal may display quick emotional responses to a stimulus, such as a startle response when confronted with a predator, affective states are longer-lasting mood states, such as anxiety or depression, which are not caused by a single stimulus, but are the result of an accumulation of experiences. Miller's adjustment to the 5 freedoms better represent how we define animal welfare today. He does this by A, placing more focus on positive goals and outcomes, and B, providing applicable welfare aims. I highly recommend reading his short paper, but to be brief, one of the limitations with the freedoms is that they are technically impossible to achieve. For example, freedom from thirst is not possible. An animal must feel thirsty in order to be motivated to drink. So instead of a rule stating freedom from thirst, it makes more sense to state provide ready access to fresh water. Also, there was the issue of the freedoms focusing on negative experiences without providing any specific direction for producing positive experiences. To solve this, the 5 provisions and animal welfare aims were created. Now, in the article, I go through each one, but we're going to skip over that because I do go through each one and sort of open them up and go through them in much more depth in a second. The 5 provisions and animal welfare aims paradigm is a very straightforward set of rules that are commonly cited by animal welfare professionals such as animal hospitals and rescues. The American Veterinary Medical Association, the Federation of Veterinarians of Europe, and the Canadian Veterinary Medical Association all list the 5 freedoms as integral to their operation and mission. These guidelines are followed and respected by the most important animal-related professionals on the planet. And because of that, they provide us with an objective framework to audit the current state of the industrialized style reptile care. It is difficult to exaggerate the importance of having a consistent set of rules to follow. Simply stating, take good care of your animals is far too broad of a statement to be useful. For example, it's like saying to somebody in the educational field, be a good teacher. The statement lacks enough detail to be rendered completely meaningless. If veterinarians use these guidelines, so can we. Okay, so now to the audit. So the first provision is good nutrition. Provide ready access to fresh water and a diet to maintain full health and vigor. And the welfare aim associated with that is minimize thirst and hunger and enable eating to be a pleasurable experience. Now, I think one could argue that we were actually doing an okay job here. To be clear, we are only discussing nutrition. This is separate from feeding enrichment. Whole prey items are typically considered sufficient when it comes to feeding snakes. Of course, it could just as easily be argued that a variety of prey items would be more beneficial. However, some snakes do not respond well to variety and may refuse to take different prey items. This may be a great place for a product like Reptile to jump in, as they offer reptile meals with a wide variety of prey items. The pro-tub argument you might hear in this domain is that tubs are better for feeding. Many keepers have success feeding finicky or picky snakes in a tub just because it is dark and quiet. Therefore, it could be said that without the comfort of the tub, the snake would not eat and therefore would be a failure to meet the requirements in this first provision. Does that mean dark tubs are a requirement to ensure optimal nutrition? No. It tells us some snakes are more comfortable eating in a dark, quiet space. Dark, quiet spaces can be incorporated into any enclosure. Provision number 2, good environment. Provide shade, shelter, or suitable housing, good air quality, and comfortable resting areas. And the welfare aim associated with that one, minimize discomfort and exposure and promote thermal, physical, and other comforts. This is certainly a subjective provision, as the word suitable is open for interpretation. Those who keep their animals in a bare tub would certainly argue they were offering an adequate environment. To keep within the confines of the provision and welfare aim, you may be able to argue that a snake living in a properly heated tub has what it needs to, quote, minimize discomfort and exposure and promote thermal, physical, and other comforts. However, as soon as you add something as simple as a light cycle to the equation, the argument falls apart. Providing a good environment should certainly include access to light, if not UV. Many tubs are opaque and do not allow for a natural light cycle to take place. And to quote John Courtney Smith again, if a species is in any way able to encounter unfiltered natural daylight in any quantity whatsoever in its wild environment, then it will have a dedicated use for and level of protection against that energy source. That is how nature works. Whether it is for its visual acuity, or producing its own vitamin D3, or sterilization of its skin, or maintenance of the respiratory tract, or bringing on hormone surges leading to reproduction, there is uses for and levels of protection against that energy source." End quote. I would argue that access to light is fundamental to fulfilling the minimum requirements for this provision, even for nocturnal animals. Nocturnal does not imply that the animal does not require daylight. It simply means they are active during the night. Animals that require absolutely no daylight are animals that are never in contact with daylight at all. For example, deep sea fish. So now to move on to the last three provisions, which is where the industrialized style care for the average pet owner falls very short. Provision number 3, good health. Prevent or rapidly diagnose and treat disease and injury and foster good muscle tone, posture, and cardiorespiratory function. And the welfare aim associated with that: minimize breathlessness, nausea, pain, and other aversive experiences, and promote the pleasure of robustness, vigor, strength, and well-coordinated physical activity. Keeping a snake in a bare tub without a doubt aids in your ability to prevent and diagnose disease. Tubs make it easy to spot changes in your snake's appearance, behavior, and feces, and also allows for very easy sterilization. This may be a crucial factor in a facility breeding a large quantity of animals. It is also certainly a crucial factor for mending sick animals or quarantining new animals. Fortunately, diseases and illness are actually a rare occurrence, especially if you're dealing with a small quantity of animals. I am not suggesting that illnesses do not occur, but I am suggesting that keeping your pet in a bare tub to prophylactically deal with an illness is an extreme measure. Provided you are optically interacting with your snake daily, you will notice illness immediately. I am not sure what the probability of a snake becoming ill is, but I do know that the probability of a snake becoming unfit in a restricting enclosure is 100%. For this provision, I will not discuss tub size as it is addressed in the next one. Instead, I am primarily auditing physical fitness. To achieve good health, the animal must have, quote, good muscle tone and cardiorespiratory function. This does not happen unless the animal can be physically active. Small bare tubs do not allow an animal to climb, burrow, or even travel a short distance. Physical activity is crucial for good health. An animal that is free to climb or dig will be more physically and mentally fit than one that doesn't have access to such behaviors. Provision number 4, appropriate behavior. Provide sufficient space, proper facilities, congenial company, and appropriately varied conditions. And the welfare aim associated with that: minimize threats and unpleasant restrictions on behavior and promote engagement in rewarding activities. This is where the industrial standards really run into major issues. The adult ball python tub size recommended by many of the big name breeding rat companies is roughly 32 inches by 16 inches by 6 inches. Even a small adult male would not be able to fully stretch out in one of these tubs. Defining what constitutes as sufficient space can be quite a controversial topic, as many keepers claim ball pythons are sedentary animals in the wild, despite this being a myth. Now, I have sources for everything. Again, I'm not going to go through all the different ball python myths in this podcast, but there is links in the description. Go check it out. You can see there's plenty of reviewed evidence that shows this. There is plenty of evidence that ball pythons are active foragers in the wild, and a tub less than 3 feet long would be considered by most as a, quote, unpleasant restriction. Plus, as I've already mentioned, ball pythons are only part of the equation. Colubrids are also kept in breeding racks with tubs of similar size or smaller. These are very active snakes in the wild, and everybody knows it. All the classic myths that are used to defend ball python tubs do not work with colubrids, as they are very active animals, and many of them are great climbers as well. Yet they are kept in the same confined conditions. It is very much worth stating that this is not an appeal to alter the care standards of mass breeding operations. Instead, this is an appeal to differentiate between mass breeding standards and individual pet care standards. If you ask a breeder to define sufficient space, they will tell you the guidelines they use for breeding. I can't think of any other animal industry that uses breeding standards as a guideline for pet care. For example, look at the way discus, the popular tropical fish, are bred versus how they are kept in the aquarium hobby. Discus breeding tanks are small, usually between 20 and 30 gallons, and usually have little to no decor aside from a breeding cone. On the other hand, the care requirements for keeping discus in your home as a pet include a tank size of between 50 and 100 gallons with driftwood and plenty of live plants, with emphasis on replicating the Amazonian floodplains to encourage naturalistic behaviors. Can a school of discus survive in an empty breeder-style setup? Yes. They will, however, be robbed of the opportunity to engage in rewarding wild-type behaviors because the conditions are perpetually static. The animal will never be required to solve a problem or explore. Breeding animals are fulfilling an entirely different purpose than an animal kept as a pet. Why do you keep the animals you keep? If you keep them because you love interacting with nature on a daily basis, then you will only be rewarded by encouraging your animal to display wild behaviors. Keeping your animals in an industrialized setup will only reveal a tiny fraction of their true potential. Provision number 5, positive mental experiences. Provide safe, congenial, and species-appropriate opportunities to have pleasurable experiences. And the welfare aim associated with that, promote various forms of comfort, pleasure, interest, confidence, and sense of control. Provisions number 4 and 5 are closely related. The only way to provide species-appropriate opportunities is by including some level of environmental enrichment in the animal's enclosure. As I have stated before, if your animal is not displaying wild-type behaviors, your setup is lacking in necessary environmental enrichment, which can lead to stress. Ideally, you have created an environment that promotes animal activity that correlates with healthy species-specific behavior, such as digging, climbing, basking, or swimming. The key to this provision is providing the snake with a sense of control of their environment. This can be accomplished by creating problems for the snake to solve, whether that be forcing them to climb to a raised basking spot or dig through substrate to find food or make a burrow. Forcing problems upon your animal while simultaneously providing them with the tools they need to solve them is crucial for accomplishing this provision. Minor levels of privation are a necessity in order to thrive. This is as true for the animals we keep as it is for humans. There is no growth without struggle. Imagine a life where you never have to solve another problem again. At first thought, that might sound appealing, but spend some time thinking about what that implies. As I've already stated, the most profound form of satisfaction an individual can extract from caring for reptiles is accomplishing something difficult by advancing your current skill set. We use our animals in order to challenge ourselves and advance our skill set. The desire to do this is not a trait inherent to Homo sapiens, but a trait inherent to life. If we are using our animals as an outlet of creativity to satisfy our need for self-advancement, can we not offer them the same in return? I am not suggesting reptiles experience the same emotional response we do when we achieve a goal, but they do have similar goal-oriented circuitry in their brain. They have a designated reward center in their brain that has the single purpose of positively reinforcing behavior related to survival, burrowing for shelter, climbing for thermal regulation, hunting, etc. Industrial care standards allow those sections of the brain to wither on the vine. To claim that this is just a form of anthropomorphism is to also make the claim you do not understand the brain of a reptile. So, in conclusion, the 5-provision framework may not be the best framework for determining the welfare of our animals, but if not, then what is? If you don't agree with the standards outlined in the 5 provisions, then you need to provide concrete, well-defined alternatives. Without clear animal welfare aims and standards, everything is open to subjective interpretation. I am proposing that we use the 5 provisions and animal welfare aims to push us out of the 3rd era into a 4th one by fostering technological improvement and shifting our focus to maximizing the life of each individual animal within our care. Industrialized style care opposes animal welfare. It is as simple as that. Here are 3 key points we can focus on to establish a 4th, more productive era. 1. Show newcomers to the reptile industry that the industrial standards for breeding is not the standard for keeping individual animals. The simple message to newcomers should be, understand what your animal's native environment looks like and incorporate enrichment into their enclosure with aims at reproducing some of their natural habitat and behavior as a consequence. Enrichment can be accomplished through enclosure size, climbing branches, substrates, water dish, large water dish for swimming. Start small and set a goal to develop the enclosure slowly over time as your competence increases. Number 2, promote wild recreation, which is a term coined by John Courtney Smith. Promote wild recreation to current reptile enthusiasts as an outlet to advance themselves in their level of care. This is not to dissuade people from starting up small breeding projects, but instead exposing them to different options to fulfill the need to advance their skill. I suspect some enthusiasts yearn for a more advanced challenge and take up breeding to satisfy that desire. It is possible that they would have been equally inclined to participate in wild recreation instead. This would both increase the welfare of the animals within their care and reduce the chances of producing any unnecessary offspring, specifically offspring that the market cannot handle. And number 3, encourage small batch breeders to bump themselves off the tub section of the continuum. Potentially, there are ways to create a more enriching and practical and feasible environment for breeding stock. If such a way exists, it will almost certainly come from the small-time breeders, as they can afford to be creative with their procedure as they are not solely driven by a bottom line. The organisms that we decide to care for in captivity are a byproduct of their natural environment, and any deviation from their natural environment is at their peril. To quote vet Dr. Kelsey Chapman, quote, reptiles are very stoic beings, end quote. Reptiles have the incredible ability to patiently and silently suffer as we work to illuminate more of the dark room to better understand exactly what they require from us. We need to remind ourselves that our reptiles have unwillingly sacrificed their lives to us, and it is our job to justify that sacrifice. We can justify this by making the promise to continue to walk down the path of advancement, whether you are taking the first step of environmental enrichment by adding your first climbing branch into your enclosure, or by studying precisely how infrared wavelengths interact with the skin cells of reptiles. Our position on the continuum is not important. Committing to advancement is. And keeping in mind that the most satisfaction you'll get from caring for your reptiles is self-advancement, this promise should be an easy one to keep and reinforce. All right, that is the end of that article. Thank you very much for sticking with me if you listened to the entire thing. Again, if you found that valuable, even if you disagree with a bunch of it or all of it or some of it, please share it. If you think this is a conversation worth being had in the reptile industry, let's get it out there. I don't have a picture of a leopard gecko biting my fingers off in the thumbnail. That's not my style. So I need you guys to help me. If you found value in this, please share it. And I'm going to go rest my voice because I had to record this so many times before I got it right. So if you're listening to this, this is the one that I got right. So thank you very much. I want to take this chance to thank the official sponsor of the podcast, which is CustomReptileHabitats.com. If you are in need of anything reptile related, definitely go check them out. There's always links in my YouTube descriptions as well as the show notes. I'll see you guys next time.